Growing up in a quiet suburban neighborhood, I always thought that nothing could go wrong in a place like ours. The streets were lined with neatly manicured lawns and children played freely, their laughter filling the air. Neighbors knew each other by name, and the kind of peace and safety you'd expect from such an environment seemed to exist in every corner. But as time went on, I started to notice strange things, little things that didn't quite add up. At first, I chalked it all up to coincidence or my overactive imagination, but soon, the bizarre occurrences began to stack up in ways that were impossible to ignore. It all began one evening after school when I was walking home. I took the usual route, past the park, around the bend, and up the hill to my house. As I passed by one of the older homes on the block, I noticed something odd. The curtains in the front window were drawn back, but there was a figure standing perfectly still in the darkened living room. It was a woman, or at least I assumed it was. She was facing directly toward me, her posture rigid, her arms by her sides. I could see the outline of her face, pale and emotionless, staring straight ahead. For a moment I thought it was just a trick of the light, or perhaps some kind of reflection. But no matter how many times I looked, the figure didn't move. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself that it was just a mannequin or a strange shadow cast by the setting sun. But over the following weeks I began to notice other strange things happening in the neighborhood. The woman would appear again, standing in that same position, staring out the window at the same time every evening. And then there were the lights. They flickered constantly. At night, when I passed by that house, the lights would go off and on in rapid succession, like someone was turning them on and off in a hurry. This happened so often that it became an unspoken rule among the kids to avoid that particular house, especially at night. But it wasn't just the strange happenings with that house. In fact, it seemed like the whole neighborhood had a strange energy about it that I couldn't explain. Other houses, usually the ones that had been around for decades, also seemed to be affected. One evening, while playing in the street with some friends, we heard a loud thumping noise coming from inside one of the nearby homes. It wasn't the sound of furniture moving or anything typical. It was rhythmic, like something was pacing the floors, back and forth, for hours. We tried knocking on the door, but no one ever answered. We'd seen the family that lived there before. They had 2 kids around our age, but we never saw them again after that night. And as time went on, that same house started to show signs of neglect. The lawn became overgrown. The windows were boarded up, and the house, which once seemed so normal, took on an eerie, decaying presence. Even more unsettling were the noises that would come from the empty homes during the dead of night. I'd be lying in bed, listening to the muffled sounds of creaking floors and tapping windows, noises that sounded far too deliberate to be caused by the wind. My parents always insisted it was just the house settling, but I wasn't so sure. One particular night, as I lay in bed, I heard a distinct sound coming from the house next door. It was a low, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. I peered out my window, straining to see in the darkness. Through the half-open blinds, I saw a shadow move across the front yard, heading toward the house with the boards on the windows. I quickly closed the blinds and ran to my parents' room, convinced something was wrong. But by the time they checked, there was nothing. No shadow, no dragging sound, nothing at all. The neighbor's house looked as it always did, quiet and still. But I knew what I heard, and I wasn't the only one. My friends, too, started to talk about things they had experienced in the neighborhood. They had heard the sounds, seen the shadows, and felt the strange energy that seemed to come and go, always just on the edge of perception. It wasn't long before rumors began to swirl about the history of our neighborhood. People talked about a string of disappearances that happened many years ago, incidents that no one had ever really explained. There were whispers of old families who had vanished without a trace, homes that had been abandoned overnight, and strange happenings that seemed to cluster around certain houses. The more I listened, the more I began to realize that the creepy occurrences were not limited to just one or two homes. The entire neighborhood, it seemed, had a dark undercurrent. One night when I was walking home after dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I quickened my pace. I could hear the sound of footsteps behind me, but when I looked back, there was no one there. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. The air grew thick with an oppressive sense of dread, and every step I took felt like it echoed in the silence. As I neared the corner of my block, I glanced at the house with the curtains, only this time, the figure wasn't in the window. There was no pale face staring back at me. Instead, the curtains were drawn, and the house seemed darker than it ever had before. I turned away, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in my gut, but as I did, I heard a faint whisper, so faint I almost thought I imagined it. It was my name, barely audible, but unmistakable. I ran the rest of the way home, my heart racing in my chest, the eerie whisper still ringing in my ears. But it didn't stop there. The next day I went back to the house, thinking that maybe it had all been some kind of bizarre dream. But as I stood on the front porch, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A note was pinned to the door, my name written on it in large, uneven letters. I didn't know how it got there, and I didn't want to know. By the time I moved out of the neighborhood a few years later, the strange occurrences were still happening. The lights would flicker, the shadows would move, and the whispers would linger in the corners of the night. Even now, when I drive through that old neighborhood, I can't help but glance at the houses, wondering if anything has changed. But something tells me that the darkness that lies beneath the surface is still there, waiting for the next unsuspecting person to notice. The suburban streets, so innocently perfect on the outside, hide a far more unsettling. In a quiet suburban neighborhood not too far from the last place I lived, a friend of mine experienced an unsettling series of events that turned the peaceful image of suburban life on its head. This neighborhood, nestled in the heart of the city's most peaceful district, seemed to embody the ideal family environment. Rows of houses with white picket fences, kids riding their bikes along the smooth sidewalks, neighbors gathering for barbecues in the backyards, everything screamed normal, but like all quiet places, its peace would soon be disrupted by something inexplicable, something that no one could explain. It started with the lights. At first, it was just the occasional flicker, something easy to dismiss, especially with old houses like the ones in that area. But when the flickering turned into full blackouts with no warning, people began to take notice. It wasn't just one or two houses, it was the entire block. I remember my friend Ashley telling me how her house had been affected. She would wake up to the sound of her lights turning off, bang a sudden silence, only for them to flicker back on minutes later. It wasn't a power surge as far as anyone could tell. No storm, no electrical problem in the area. The timing seemed far too precise. At first, it was a minor inconvenience. But then, things started escalating in ways that Ashley couldn't ignore. There was a particular night when she came home late after a friend's birthday party. The moon was bright, but something felt off. The streets were empty, no cars, no kids out playing, just a heavy stillness hanging in the air. As she walked up her driveway, she noticed something strange. Someone was standing at the end of the street, just standing there in the dark, completely motionless. Ashley couldn't make out their face, but their outline was tall and thin, a silhouette against the streetlights. The figure didn't move, just stood there staring into the shadows. For a split second, she thought about calling out to them, asking if they needed help, but something stopped her. There was something unsettling about the way the person didn't acknowledge her presence. After a moment, Ashley walked quickly to her front door, her senses heightened, her heart pounding in her chest. As she unlocked the door and stepped inside, she glanced over her shoulder one last time. The figure was gone. The next morning, Ashley and her mom found that their mailbox had been tipped over, the contents strewn across the yard. They thought it was probably just some kids messing around, nothing serious, and brushed it off. But then, as she was walking home from school a few days later, Ashley noticed something more disturbing. The same figure, or at least someone who resembled the same tall silhouette, was standing at the corner of their street. This time, however, it was much closer to her house, standing right in front of the sidewalk that led to their driveway. Ashley froze. Her instinct was to turn around, go back the way she came, but her feet were frozen. The figure didn't move, just stood still, and then, slowly, it turned and walked down the street without a word, no sound, no rustling leaves or crunching footsteps, just the unmistakable feeling that something wasn't quite right. Ashley's heart raced. When she got home that night, she locked every door, closed all the windows, and tried to ignore the feeling that something was watching her, just out of sight. The strange occurrences continued. Days later, Ashley received a mysterious letter at her doorstep. No return address, no name, just an envelope with her address scrawled on the front in uneven handwriting. When she opened it, there was nothing but a single word written inside in large block letters. Leave, that was it. Nothing more, no explanation, no other markings, just that single chilling command. Her parents didn't know what to make of it, chalking it up to a prank, but Ashley knew that something wasn't right. She began to notice more unusual things happening around her home. Her backyard gate was left open one morning, even though they always locked it. Her bedroom window had been left ajar one night, something she was sure she'd closed. And worst of all, she began hearing the sounds of footsteps outside her window at night, the slow, deliberate pacing that seemed to be just outside her house, always when she was alone. Ashley started spending more time at her friend's house across town, hoping to escape the eerie sensations that plagued her home. It wasn't until a particularly unsettling encounter with the same figure that she realized the truth. One evening, after a week of no strange sightings, Ashley returned home to find the street quiet as usual. Her parents weren't home, and the house felt empty. As she reached the front door, she noticed the strange figure again, standing at the far end of the street. This time, though, something was different. The figure was no longer still. It was moving, slowly, almost imperceptibly. As it came closer, Ashley noticed something terrifying. The figure wasn't human. It was taller than any person she had ever seen, with long, gangly limbs that didn't quite seem to fit. The face, when she finally caught a glimpse of it, was hollow, featureless, like a blank mask of skin. At that moment, Ashley ran inside, bolting the door behind her and locking every window. She sat in the dark, shaking, trying to figure out what to do. She was terrified. It was as though whatever it was, whatever entity had been lurking around her house, knew exactly where she lived, knew how to make itself known, and now it was closing in on her. In the following days, she gathered up her courage and confronted her parents with everything. After some resistance, they agreed to move to a different part of town. But even after they left, Ashley couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following her. The odd occurrences, the unsettling figure, the strange messages, they haunted her, always lurking in the back of her mind. Now, years later, Ashley never returned to that neighborhood. The house was sold, and she lost touch with the neighbors. But to this day, she's convinced that something in that area still lingers, waiting, watching. There's something about the quiet suburban neighborhoods, the calm before the storm, that holds something dark, something lurking in the shadows, just beyond reach. And I can't help but wonder how many other neighborhoods, just like hers, are hiding secrets of their own. When I first moved into the quiet suburban neighborhood, I was eager for a fresh start. The neighborhood was peaceful, the houses well kept, and it seemed like a perfect place to settle into. The trees lining the streets gave the area a sense of privacy, and the houses, though old, had a certain charm to them. Little did I know, that charm hid something much darker than I ever could have imagined. The house I purchased was on the outskirts of the neighborhood, far enough away from the bustle but still close enough to everything I needed. It was an older property, with creaky floors and the unmistakable smell of old wood and dust. But as I began settling in, strange things began to happen. It started with little things, footsteps when no one was around, objects moved from where I remembered leaving them, and the occasional flicker of lights. At first I brushed it off as being part of the house settling, but over time, the incidents became too frequent to ignore. One evening, I was in the kitchen making dinner when I noticed something odd. A footprint was imprinted in the dust near the back door, large and muddy. My first instinct was to check that all the doors were locked. They were. I wondered if I'd been so caught up in unpacking that I hadn't noticed someone had entered, but that didn't seem likely. I shrugged it off, thinking it must have been some kind of mistake or a trick of the light. But the doubt lingered in the back of my mind. The next day, things took a more unsettling turn. I was in the living room working on some paperwork when I heard unmistakable footsteps coming from upstairs. It was clear, heavy, deliberate steps. My heart skipped a beat as I realized I was alone in the house. No one else had a key. I hesitated for a moment, then slowly made my way up the stairs. When I reached the top, I checked every room. Nothing. I was starting to question my own sanity, but the feeling of unease only intensified. The days that followed seemed to be filled with strange occurrences. Sometimes I would hear a noise from one room only to find it empty when I investigated. Other times I would find objects in places I was certain I hadn't left them. It was as if something was playing tricks on me. But the most disturbing thing was the room at the end of the hall, the spare bedroom. I'd never used it, hadn't even bothered to unpack the boxes in it yet. It was just a room, but it felt different. Every time I walked by, there was a chill in the air, a sense that someone or something was watching me from within. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something in there, even when the room was empty. One night, the silence of the house was shattered by a loud bang coming from the spare bedroom. I jumped out of bed, heart racing, and ran to the room. I opened the door and looked inside. Everything seemed in its place, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. But as I turned to leave, a cold draft swept through the room, and the door slammed shut behind me. I had no explanation. I was frightened, but I didn't want to seem irrational, so I tried to push the fear aside. But the strange happenings only escalated. The footsteps would echo through the house, always leading up to that spare room. Sometimes I would hear a voice, faint and distant, but when I'd investigate, there was no one there. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. So one day, I decided to speak with the neighbors. I struck up a conversation with Mrs. Harper, an older woman who had lived on the street for as long as anyone could remember. I casually mentioned that I had been experiencing some strange things in my house, hoping she might have some insight. Her response was chilling. She told me that I wasn't the first to experience odd occurrences in that house. The previous owner, a woman named Clara, had lived there for many years. Mrs. Harper told me Clara had always been quiet, a bit of a recluse. After living in the house for almost 2 decades, Clara had simply disappeared without a word to anyone. No one knew where she went, but there were rumors that she had grown increasingly fearful of something in the house. According to Mrs. Harper, Clara had mentioned hearing footsteps, seeing shadows move, and even feeling like she was being watched. Eventually, Clara couldn't take it anymore and moved out in the dead of night, leaving everything behind. Mrs. Harper didn't know where she went, but she warned me that the house had a history of unsettling events, especially in the spare bedroom. I decided to look deeper into the history of the house. I visited the local library and dug through old records, hoping to find something that might explain the strange occurrences. But there were no clear answers, just vague references to previous owners who had left suddenly. The more I researched, the more it seemed that something had always been off about the house. Then I met another neighbor, Cindy, who had lived on the street for decades. She had heard stories from older residents about the property's history, but the most unsettling one was about a young couple who had lived in the house years ago. They had been renovating the basement when they discovered a hidden room, one that had been sealed off. When they opened it, strange things began happening. They heard whispers, voices that weren't their own, and felt as if they were being watched constantly. They moved out shortly after, never to return. I didn't know what to make of it all. Was the house haunted? Was there something more sinister at work? It was impossible to ignore the connection between the footsteps, the locked spare room, and the strange history of the property. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I couldn't stay. Whatever was in that house, whether it was a ghost, a presence, or something else, I wasn't going to let it drive me out of my home. I decided to confront the room that had haunted me for weeks. I gathered my courage and went to the spare bedroom, determined to find out once and for all what was happening. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and immediately felt the temperature drop. The air felt thick, oppressive. I walked into the center of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was bare, save for a few scattered boxes I hadn't unpacked yet, but something was different. The silence was deafening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I felt a sudden compulsion to look at the wall. That's when I saw it, scratched into the surface, barely visible, was a symbol I hadn't noticed before. My fingers traced the outline of the symbol, and as I did, the temperature in the room dropped even further. I suddenly heard a sound behind me, like footsteps, but louder this time. I turned around, but the room was empty. That was the moment I knew I couldn't stay. The room, the footsteps, the sense of something watching me, it all felt too much to ignore. I locked the door, packed my things, and left the house for good. The neighborhood might have seemed perfect at first, but there was something deeply wrong with that house. To this day, I don't know what it was, whether it was a ghost, a creature, or something far worse, but I'll never forget the way the house made me feel. Sometimes, when I pass by that street, I can't help but glance at the house from a distance, wondering if anyone else has experienced what I did. All I know for sure is that some houses hold on to their secrets, and some things are better left undisturbed. When my family and I moved into our suburban home, I didn't expect to be writing about the strange and terrifying events that would unfold. We were excited for a quiet life, new beginnings in a peaceful neighborhood. It was everything we wanted. The neighbors were friendly, and the children had already made friends, playing together in the yards. The house itself was charming, with a small front porch and large windows that let in plenty of light. But there was something I couldn't shake about the place, something unsettling. It started with little things, nothing major at first. One evening, I had left the living room light on while I went to bed, but when I woke up, it was off. I didn't think much of it at the time, chalking it up to forgetfulness or a glitch in the bulb. But as days went by, other strange things began happening. Doors that I thought I had locked were mysteriously open, and items I was certain I had placed in one spot would show up in an entirely different room. My initial reaction was disbelief. Surely I was just misplacing things, or perhaps the kids had been playing around without telling me. But then, the oddities began to feel intentional. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, the house felt unnervingly cold. It wasn't just the usual chill of an old house, it was as if someone had turned down the thermostat without me noticing. I assumed it was just the weather, but when I walked into the kitchen I felt an icy draft, almost as if something was moving through the air, brushing against me. When I turned to look at the window, I noticed it was still shut tightly. The source of the cold was impossible to identify. The occurrences escalated. The front door would sometimes open on its own, slowly, as if it were being gently pushed by an unseen force. There were also noises that didn't belong, a faint tapping against the walls, whispering voices when no one else was around, and a constant feeling of being watched, even in the dead of night. The worst part was when I started hearing footsteps coming from the attic. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but the sounds were too deliberate, too purposeful. I never had the courage to go up there, but the sound of shuffling footsteps and the occasional scraping against the walls would continue, night after night. One afternoon, I was working in my office when I noticed movement outside my window. Thinking it was one of the children playing in the yard, I looked outside. But the yard was empty, and the movement I'd seen was only the swaying of the trees in the wind. Still, a sense of unease settled in my stomach as I returned to my work. That night when I went to bed, I heard the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, moving around downstairs. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay in bed, straining to hear any more sounds. The footsteps were faint, but they were there. I told myself it was just the house shifting, but the sound was so clear and precise that it was hard to ignore. Then the doorbell rang, just once, but it was unmistakable. I crept out of bed, trying to steady my breath, but when I peered through the peephole, no one was there. My heart raced in my chest as I locked the door and made sure all the windows were secured. In the following weeks, things only got worse. I began seeing shadowy figures moving in the corners of my vision. At first, I chalked it up to stress and lack of sleep, but the figures grew more distinct over time, tall, thin, with indistinguishable features. They didn't seem to be doing anything but standing there, watching. And no matter how often I looked directly at them, they would disappear before I could get a good look. I spoke to my neighbors about it. I wasn't sure what I expected, maybe to find out I wasn't alone in experiencing strange occurrences, but their reactions were strange. One neighbor, Mr. Thompson, mentioned that he had heard odd noises in the past, but he never thought much of them. Another neighbor, Mrs. Kelly, claimed that the house had been fine when they lived in it years ago. No one seemed to know anything about the unsettling history of the home, but they didn't seem all that surprised by my experiences either. It wasn't until I spoke to the older woman across the street, Mrs. Harrison, that I got a glimpse of the house's past. She had lived on the street for decades, and while she was quiet and reclusive, she seemed to know more than she let on. She mentioned that the previous owners of my house had left suddenly, without any explanation. The woman who had lived there before had been young and full of life, but one morning she just vanished. There were rumors that something had driven her out, but no one could confirm exactly what had happened. As I listened to Mrs. Harrison's stories, a sense of dread began to creep in. It felt as though my house was trying to tell me something that no one was willing to admit. The sounds, the shadows, the strange occurrences, they all pointed to the same thing: something was wrong with this place. One night, when I was sitting in the living room reading, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease wash over me. I could feel it in my bones, a pressure, like a weight pressing down on me. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling only grew stronger. It felt as though the air in the room had thickened, becoming almost suffocating. I got up to open a window for fresh air, but as soon as I touched the handle, I heard the footsteps again, this time louder than ever. They were coming from above, from the attic. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. My curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to investigate. With a flashlight in hand, I climbed the stairs to the attic, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, I felt a gust of cold air rush past me. The attic was dark, except for the faint light from my flashlight. I moved slowly, scanning the room for anything unusual. There was nothing at first, just boxes and old furniture covered in dust. But then I saw it, a faint glow coming from the corner of the room. It was a small, almost imperceptible light, but it was there. As I approached, the light grew brighter until I could make out an object. It was a small, ornate mirror, covered in cobwebs. When I reached out to touch it, I heard the footsteps again, this time much closer. Suddenly, the room felt smaller, more suffocating. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me in the darkness. The footsteps echoed around me, getting louder with each passing second. My breath quickened as I struggled to open the door. The air was thick, oppressive, as if something was closing in on me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the door opened on its own, and the footsteps stopped. I ran out of the attic and didn't look back. The mirror was gone the next day, as though it had never been there at all. The house felt quieter, but the sense of dread lingered, a constant reminder of what I had felt. I moved out of the house not long after that night, unable to shake the feeling that something dark and malicious had been lingering there. The neighborhood had once seemed so perfect, but I couldn't ignore what I had experienced. To this day, I wonder if the house still holds its secrets, waiting for the next unsuspecting family to move in and discover what lies hidden within its walls. There was something